Good evening, everybody. I have the privilege to speak to Dave Hickey this evening, and I would love to start off with asking you how you got started in medtech.
Oh, So Lisa, it is great to be here, and I think over my 40 years in the industry, I've done a lot of fireside chats and a lot of keynotes. I think this is the venue. This is just awesome. But just to start, so this will certainly date me, and depending upon the audience reaction, I think it will sort of date the audience too. So I started when I was in the UK. I fell in love with a program called Quincy MD
On television.
on
Yeah.
television. So Jack Klugman was this pathologist. He worked in a hospital. I actually had no intention or sort of desire that I wanted to go and do autopsies and things,
Yeah.
but the discipline of pathology and what they did on Quincy was the real start, and that got me sort of connected to careers counselor, and ultimately I went to do clinical biochemistry at Manchester University.
Wow. And then, and so what was your first job in medtech?
So after doing the good thing about working in the UK NHS is they have a rotational program. So after doing sort of pathology or clinical biochemistry at Manchester, I got a job in a local UK hospital in the NHS. And the first 2 years, actually, you spend doing a rotation. So, I did sort of 6 months of hematology, 6 months of biochemistry, 6 months anatomic pathology, and a little bit of microbiology. But at that time, it became very clear to me that biochemistry was the field that I wanted to do, just because of the endocrinology and things like that. So I started in a lab in the north of the UK, just between Manchester and Liverpool, and I did 7 years as a clinical biochemist.
Yeah. So tell us more about how your journey into medtech
Yeah.
and then your journey here to the United States.
Yeah, journey to the United. Yeah, so as the audience can tell, although I live and work in Baltimore and run Becton Dickinson Life Sciences from Baltimore, I am not a native Baltimorean. But I came to the US in 2003. So the very quick journey was one of first 7 years after graduating in the UK NHS. I then went actually to work for Bayer Diagnostics, did sales, marketing, product management, and then I did a variety of roles in the UK and Ireland for Bayer. And at the time, in 2003, I got the opportunity, purely from a personal development perspective, to come to the US, because although I was working for Bayer in the UK, their global headquarters was in Tarrytown, New York. So part of my personal development was to go and do a global role. So I came over to really be the global head of marketing for Bayer's immunoassay business at that time, with the goal of actually then going back in 2006 to a broader or bigger Bayer role back in the UK and Ireland. But as many of this team and audience will know, in 2007, there was a due diligence activity of Siemens Healthcare looking to get into IVD and looking to get into diagnostics. And I got on that due diligence team. That M&A went through. So Bayer divested Bayer Diagnostics into Siemens. And through that M&A in 2007, I got a chance to localize and then sort of take a senior role in the new Siemens Healthcare Diagnostics. So we've been in the US 21 years now.
Wow. And so you didn't really think you were going to be here that long?
I did not know. It was funny. My wife was actually a general practitioner in the UK at the time, thinking that we were here for like a 3-year rotation. She just sort of put her practice and did locums and things like that. But then, obviously, when we decided in 2006 and 7 to stay, then obviously she sold the practice. Honestly, the children were well settled at school, and we've never looked back. It was a
Yeah.
great opportunity.
So what was that? What happened next? What's after Siemens?
Yeah, so I was really, so if I think about the continuity of Bayer Siemens from the time I started with Bayer until I left Siemens in 2015, 14 to go to BD. So I was 21 years with Siemens. At the time of leaving Siemens, I was the CEO of the central lab IVD business, the diagnostics business. And then in 2014, I was hired into BD. And the two things that really, to me, from a Becton Dickinson perspective, that were sort of enticing or intriguing about that opportunity, one was I'd never really done a lot of infectious disease diagnostics.
Yeah.
And before I took over as life sciences, I really came in to run the diagnostics business or the microbiology piece of that. So it was a great learning opportunity for me to apply sort of executive general managerial skills, but to an area of lab medicine that I'd never really studied or worked in. And then also BD had made an acquisition of some microbiology lab automation back in 2012, which just really needed some optimization. And again, for many of us that have been in the major lab automation arena for many, many years, lab automation outside of micro started in 1998. So microbiology was a bit of a laggard.
Yeah.
So part of my role was to come in and optimize the automation business.
Yeah. Now, I was just going to say, in your role, you're seeing quite a few driving trends that are affecting the market. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think before I do, just a little bit of context on Becton Dickinson overall for the members of the audience that don't know BD. So, I'm very privileged to run the life science segment. But if I take a step back, BD is about a $20 billion revenue company, about 70,000 people around the world, and we operationalize ourselves into 3 operating segments. So we have life sciences, which for me is the diagnostics business, the pre-analytical business, and biosciences, which is primarily centered on flow cytometry. There is the medical segment, and then there is the interventional segment. So the medical segment basically was a result of the CareFusion acquisition in 2015 that BD did. And then the interventional segment was really the result of the CR Bard acquisition in 2017. So at the highest level, BD is 20 billion, 3 segments, and then each segment has got three business units. So there are 9 business units that make up the operating entity. I took over life sciences in 2021, which is now diagnostics, pre-analytical, and biosciences. From a size and scope perspective, it is close to 15,000 people worldwide, and it is about $5.5 billion in revenue.
Right.
And we do the entire value chain of innovation, scouting, technology, M&A, feeds the innovation funnel, manufacturing, commercialization.
Right. Great. And then, so now, so now the trends.
So if you look at BD, one of the things that we always say about Becton Dickinson is it really is a significant part of the backbone of healthcare. So if I just look at the United States, for example, BD is present in over 90% of healthcare systems, of hospitals. So there's a significant durability to what BD does. But as we've taken a step back and looked at how will healthcare be delivered going forward, we've really identified, and this is really coming out of, I would say, the back of the pandemic. We think there are 3 major trends, what we call transformative forces, that are going to shape the way healthcare is delivered going forward. And the nice thing about these 3 trends, at least from BD's perspective, is not only do they have applicability to life sciences, but they've got applicability to all of the segments and all of the business units. So the first of those 3 trends is what we call smart connected care. And it really is a premise that is based on the ever-increasing role of robots, digitalization, AI. The one example I would give specifically within life sciences is if I think about the pathology lab, where, from a staffing perspective, there is real sort of significant labor arbitrage. So a lot of medical technicians that work in a lab are, I'd say, a high percentage of retirement eligible. The medical technology schools that are meant to then be the feeders to replace those associates, there are less and less medical technology schools, but the labs have a workload that is increasing at like 8 to 10% per annum.
Yeah.
So their demand for automation, track-based automation, artificial intelligence to look at rules-based algorithms to disposition results and things like that, we see that trend for smart connected care as being a big driver. Many of the labs that I deal with have this concept of what they call a lights out laboratory. How can they run the work that they need to run, but with as few as staff as possible? And the staff that do remain, they then want to deploy onto more value-added tasks, adopting and setting up new technologies. So that's the first trend. The second trend is one of what we call migration to new care settings. In fact, I was at a couple of the sessions earlier today, and there was a lot of dialogue around, the alternate sites of care and the ASCs. And I think one of the things that we're seeing definitely on the back of the pandemic is that this migration to healthcare delivery outside of the hospital. It's interesting, BD, we're very, I'll give sort of maybe two anecdotes here is we're very much focused on the hospital at home. And it's interesting because when you think about the pandemic, when all the hospitals had the sort of, let's say, the beds filled with critically ill patients, they still had to figure out how to run and serve a patient population in very much a decentralized setting.
Yeah.
And if you look at the growth in hospital at home right now, I would say since 2020, there's been a 5-fold increase in the number of Medicare-approved hospitals that are now driving hospital at home strategies. There's about, in the US alone, there are 308 hospitals. It's across 37 states, 129 healthcare systems. So I think the demand for hospital at home, whether it's blood collection, diagnostic testing, home-based infusion, home-based catheterization, fluid management, that is a wave that is starting. And then certainly in life sciences, and when I think about diagnostics, the ever-increasing role of point of care. Again, many, many sessions on point of care today. And I think, there are different phases to point of care. So we think of point of care as being done in an ICU or an ER, maybe our primary care facility, but we're starting to see retail pharmacy and retail stores adopt point of care testing. On the back of COVID, there is definitely going to be more and more tests, the right sort of test that gets done at home. And then the final trend is improving chronic disease outcome. I think at the end of the day, all of us are in this industry to have a positive impact on the patient outcome and the patient life and the quality of life. And if you think about things like cancer and oncology, there is so much cost consequence and cost burden with the sort of stage 3, stage 4 chronic diseases. With the advancement of new innovation, new technologies, how do we left curve shift the cost equation? So now when I look at things like sequencing technologies, the ability to detect and screen for disease earlier, anything that we can do to earlier detect, treat, chronic diseases can only be for the better. So chronic disease outcome is a big third driver.
Any examples you want to provide?
Yeah, so I think the two examples that I would give, or the one example I would give for, let's say, chronic diseases is really around something like cervical cancer and the role of HPV. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later on too, but one of the other things that we're very focused on is how we think about the role of health equity and health access. And you think about something like cervical cancer, and it's still a significant killer. It's actually very much a preventable disease. Yet even here in the United States, as the guidelines move towards something like HPV as the primary standard of care, there are still 1 in 5 eligible females that never get screened. And there are, and even based on the most recent data, there are about 23% of females that are overdue for the follow-up screening cycle. And when you start to dig into that and you look at the drivers of that, one of it is that they're sort of fearful of just the invasiveness or the collection procedure by somebody else. So, one of the things that actually, we're working on, we've already sort of deployed this outside the United States, but our self-collection strategies. Because if we can reach the people that don't get screened, and we can do that through a self-collection strategy where a female can literally, with simple instructions for use, actually sort of take a swab at home, mail it into a testing laboratory, then I think the chances of, again, minimizing the impact of the disease is going to be huge. One other example I would give is in the field of blood collection. There's been a lot of innovation recently on capillary-based blood collection, and the stat that I would share with this audience is if you look at just over 65-year-olds in the United States, there's about 22 million individuals that never get their blood tested. And the breakdown of that is about 10 million will go and see their physician for their annual screen. They'll get the blood testing script, but they'll never get it followed up. The other 12% just never go and see their physician at all. And again, one of the big drivers there is an absolute fear of venipuncture. So people are scared about putting needles into their arm. So, BD recently, we had an innovation cleared in December. We're now in a very decentralized setting by not necessarily a doctor or a nurse. And we're seeing, this is where we're starting to see retail pharmacists look for other sources of income or visiting nurse services to home, that you can actually now do lab-based quality diagnostic testing on a very small amount of capillary blood. So that's an example where we are decentralizing, again, the migration to care settings, but it feeds an ecosystem, because imagine those individuals now do get their blood tested, and you're starting to pick up things like hyperlipidemia and diabetes and heart disease. It also feeds the benefit of impacting chronic disease outcome.
Now, how are there other ways that BD is building and reshaping its business with these trends in mind?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've actually done is we're starting to over-index where we want to put our innovation dollars. We're also starting to over-index on how we think about the M&A funnel, our inorganic opportunities. And what we're trying to do is, as I said earlier on, is there's a significant piece of BD's business that is what we call a durable core. We manufacture 10 billion blood collection devices a year. We manufacture billions of syringes a year. That is never going to go away, but it's, they are slower market growth categories. So when you look at these transformative trends, they're starting to operate in market segments and categories where the growth rates of those technologies or those applications are high single digits or low double digits, or if not greater. That's become a big area of focus for us. So as we think about our R&D dollars, and we think about what we call the WAMGR, or the weighted average market growth rate of a certain category, if there's an organic or inorganic opportunity that fits those transformative areas, that's where we'll spend the majority of our focus.
Right. So I think there's a lot of startups here.
Yep.
That are looking for partnering, and they'd probably like to know, how does BD approach M&A and partnerships with respect to these new areas?
That's great. So yes, I mean, obviously BD as a major strategic, and I think a lot of other multinationals, we have a lot of opportunity, and we get a lot of what we call inbound. So obviously for us, and it was made actually in a presentation earlier today, where you tend to find that these strategics and the multinationals, we're pretty risk averse. So I would say to the CEOs of the startups is, if you're going to approach a strategic, really take time and effort to understand their strategy. Where are our areas of strategic focus? Every company like BD has what we call these hunting grounds. So we know what's going to change healthcare. We know where we want to spend our acquisition dollars or our R&D innovation dollars. So I would say, take time to understand our areas of strategic focus to the extent that any sort of startup company can present meaningful data, because obviously depending upon where a startup is at in its sort of phase and its cycle, some of them are data rich, some of them are lacking data. Normally, if some of the startups are lacking data at that time, we'll want to maintain a relationship, but we'll maybe put it more into a watch and wait. I would encourage the CEOs of the startups to be very clear on their own strategy. So, are you pursuing an exit strategy or are you pursuing commercialization? But I think any time that you can approach somebody like BD, somebody like my life science team, and you've been able to de-risk the technology, that heightens the attractiveness of that technology for coming into BD. I would say we'll look at we do a lot of startup work. I would say if I think about BD overall, one of the sweet spots that we have are technologies that are a really cool strategic fit for us. They may be just pre-revenue or early revenue, but then we can bring globalization and scale.
Right. So you've had many interesting acquisitions and investments. Is there any you would like to highlight, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think, one of the questions I often get is, and for BD overall, is how do we think about our acquisition strategy, our investment strategy? And one of the things that we've been very public on, particularly after we acquired Bard and Kerfusion, is, over a couple of years, BD's posture was to do more of an M&A strategy that was like multiple tuck-ins. And, over the last, I want to say maybe 18, 24 months, we did like 19 acquisitions. We're changing that posture now because even though each of those acquisitions were relevant, it's still the complexity of an integration. So you've still got to think about R&D synergies, Salesforce synergies, ERP systems, quality systems, regulatory systems. So what we're doing right now, and I would say the Parata pharmacy automation was a good example of this. If you think about BD as having something around maybe $2 billion of cash to deploy on an annual basis, we are now more favoring a 1 to a 1.5 billion, still a tuck-in, it's not transformative, but a 1 to a 1.5 billion with them more maybe 4 to 500 million of 2 billion left on a few smaller tuck-ins. So that's on the M&A piece. On the equity piece, we do that as well. So for us in life sciences, we typically will not do equity just purely to get a financial ROI. It's more on what we would call the build to buy model. And then we'll do two things. We will either put an equity stake in. One that we did was around Day Zero Diagnostics, which is a rapid AST next-gen sequencing platform. And in those sorts of situations, the company still runs the company, but then we would take something like a board observer position, which we did in this last round with them, so that we can help stay connected. So we'll do equity, typically would result in a board observer position. And with that board observer, we can still help provide the guidance for the types of data that we'd want to see. We've got a lot of global knowledge in terms of the trends that are happening in these technology spaces, and we're able to share that with the team.
Great. And I think we're near the conclusion here. There's a lot of startup CEOs in the audience. Do you have any advice for them? Any watch outs, best ways to partner?
Yeah. So I think we talked about it a little bit earlier on as part of one of the questions. But what I would say and I'm sure a lot of the CEOs are all over this already and doing this is, so just from the board work that I do and the engagements that I sit on, when you think about the technology or the platform or the product that you're trying to commercialize and develop, do a lot of work to anticipate what's the trend in healthcare at the time of your perceived launch. So not what you're developing today, but is it still going to fulfill and meet that unmet critical need, clinical need, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now? Think about the space that you're in or that you're getting into, and make sure that the board and the board makeup, from an advisory perspective, has got the right skill set, the right caliber, the right experience to guide you along the way. And then I think, if this then was a potential partnering discussion with a strategic like BD, with a multinational, then for me, the two biggest guidances are: be as data-driven as you can when you come to talk to us. And, to what extent can you articulate how you've de-risked the technology? And then I think, and then the conversation goes from there.
Well, thank you so much, Dave Hickey. And it's been an absolute pleasure. And we very much appreciate you having you here.
Lisa, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.